You are listening to Chthonia, the podcast of the dark feminine. Chthonia's logo was designed by J.R. Malpair. Background music is Phantasm by Kevin MacLeod. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Chthonia, the last one for the year 2019. I'm your host, Breege Burke, and in the sort of tradition that we have here, we're actually in the midst of what they would call when this podcast is going to be released, it's going to be in the midst of what we call the 12 days of Christmas, that time between December 25, kind of maybe starting with the Yule season, on, around December 21st, 22nd, depending on where you are. Ending, of course, with the Epiphany on January 6th, which tends to have more relevance to, there's certainly celebrations within the Catholic Church of the Epiphany, but there's also, it tends to have a little bit more meaning for the Orthodox Christians who tend to celebrate their Christmas around January 6th, around that time. The subject I thought would be a good one for today and to end the year is I want to talk a little bit about some of the European Christmas traditions of the dark feminine, particularly Frau Perchta and who is a Germanic figure. I'm not going to say just Germany because Germanic encompasses quite a few European countries, and also parts of Eastern Europe as well, but also the Icelandic figure of Gryla, who is they're very similar. I'm not going to say that they're identical, but they are very similar in terms of their role and what they do and how their role has changed over time. Now, I think probably the best way for me to start this discussion is to explain who each of these figures are, what the folklore is behind them, as I can best that I can. I'm going to try to avoid too many Icelandic names, mainly because I'm reading them and I'm going, that I'm going to destroy right out, even if I take some time to go to one of those translation pages and listen to how it's said, somehow it will still come out wrong. So I just thought, no, you know what, I'll just try to do as much as I can without too many names that I'm not going to destroy. So I'm going to talk about both of them, and I also kind of want to talk about why are these particular figures, what are their connections to St. Nicholas, what are their connections to Santa Claus and to Krampus and to some of these other things, and what's the importance of their associations? Because as you might expect, the associations that these particular figures have in folklore and their role actually connects to something that is probably connected to some traditions that are much older, dealing with this particular time of year. So let me just actually, probably a good way to preface all this is to talk a little bit about what we're talking about by this time of year. Winter holidays. There are so many winter holidays now. There are some more modern ones like Kwanzaa, for example. There's the festival of Hanukkah, which has to do with a celebrating of the oil miraculously lasting during the Maccabean revolt when Macedonian king or the Greek king tried to, basically desecrated the Jewish temple and and wanted to have statues of Zeus installed. And so, and they desecrated the Holy of Holies, so this was the one, one untouched vial that was not destroyed or didn't lose its purity, that was able to last a certain number of days once the other soldiers, the Greeks, were driven out. And this was something that the Jews had done with the help of the Romans at that time. So anyway, I don't want to get too much into the history of Hanukkah, but it is another holiday that's associated with this time. Yule is a holiday that we tend to think of as having to do with, the fact that it's the darkest day of the year and the light begins to return after these solstice days. We're in the deepest darkness, and things will start to gradually get lighter every day, which is probably why you have an association with this day and Christmas. Christmas is the celebration of the birth of Jesus Christ. Now, historically, if Jesus is a historical person, Jesus is probably actually born in the spring. But the connection here is this idea of a sort of a divine son, S-O-N, connected to the divine son, S-U-N, which may be, I know I had a discussion with some people about this, that may be the connection between Sol Invictus and some of these other figures ending up being kind of either conflated with or somehow creating a context for Christianity with the idea of Christ as sort of this Son of God who is a savior figure, and that kind of association with the Son, S-U-N, whether originally intended or not. That, these sun gods, these celestial gods, tend to become associated with the quote-unquote Son of God. And of course, all of the legends surrounding the birth of Jesus, certainly, there's the whole story of Mary and Joseph. And, of course, Mary becomes pregnant. She's a virgin. An angel comes to her and tells her that, God has given her a child. And then, and Joseph goes along with this, and, they get married, and then they're going to, they're kind of fleeing their country, and they're looking for a place to stay. So that she can deliver her baby, but the inn they go to is full, so they get put out into a manger, which is like a stable where the horses and the sheep and are. And she gives birth there to the child Jesus, who is supposed to be the Christ child, and all of the things that go along with that. There's the three magi, and magi, of course, in this case, are not magicians per se. They are Zoroastrians, probably. That's the term that was used for them, for Zoroastrian priests. But they did a whole lot. They were some of the early users of astrology and astronomy and so forth. And so the idea was that there was these three wise. They call them three wise men, but they're these three Zoroastrian priests who apparently see this prediction. I think it was a kind of a Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, if I remember correctly. I'm not swearing that I have that exactly right. But at that point, they decide to make a trip, and then they find, but then, of course, they start asking too many questions about trying to find a king, which is why then they become in danger and they have to flee to Egypt after the baby's born. But they supposedly come and they bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh to this child who's in a stable. Okay, that's the legend, that's the folklore. The historical reality of that is not something we get into, whether that's real or not. But that was the story that has grown up around that. And the day that the wise men come, or these Zoroastrians, is known as the Feast of the Epiphany. Now, in the Orthodox Church, Epiphany is more of a celebration of the baptism of Jesus, okay, which actually would happen much later on, certainly not 12 days after he was born. But when he goes to the River Jordan and is baptized by John the Baptist, that's the Epiphany. That's supposed to be the moment of manifestation, the moment when there's a moment of clarity there where the truth behind the evident, the reality of who this person is suddenly shows itself and becomes evident. It's like there's a vision, and now with clarity that this is, who Jesus is through this. Okay, so all that's kind of background, because it occurs to me that there's still a lot of people who don't really understand what Christmas is about, or about what that particular, that story in that episode. I don't want to take for granted that people know that backdrop. It's important for this, so I apologize for a lot of prefacing here, but it is important to understand these other stories and their context, at least, in the more 19th century and later context. All right, so Frau Perchta, both her and Gryla are associated with these 12 days of Christmas, and Perchta, who's also her name usually translates to Bertha or Bertha, and who has other counterparts like Befana in Italy. They're both connected with the 12 days of Christmas, and they serve a rather interesting kind of role. Let me just read a little bit about Perchta first. Okay, so this is from an article by John B. Smith called "Perchta the Belly Slitter." And he says, who is or who was the Frau Perchta of Southern German and Austrian folklore? In short answer might be, like our own Father Christmas or the Italian Befana, she is a mysterious figure said to be at large at one time or another during the 12 days of Christmas, receiving offerings, rewarding those who conform to certain norms, and looking askance on those who do not. On the whole, Perchta is a sinister figure who punishes the slovenly, the idle, the greedy, the inquisitive. Refractory children and even adults are in danger of having their stomachs ripped open by her. She will then remove the contents, even the intestines, and replace them with refuse, or in some versions with straw and pebbles, which I guess you could see as a kind of refuse. Just occasionally, we glimpse a different side of Perchta's nature. Among the Slavines, she was a tall, powerfully built woman living in the groves and mountain chasms, but also in the depths of lakes in the summer. Okay, now this is interesting because Perchta is associated with the mountains, and we'll see that Gryla will also be associated with the mountains. But then also the depths. So there's some underworld associations there, but we'll get to that. In the winter, she withdrew to the inside of the mountains, where, like Frau Halle, she made the snow. In the winter months, she also occupied herself with spinning, and when the shepherds brought flax to her in the summer, she blessed their flocks. The shepherds claimed to see her walking above the steepest slopes at twilight, a golden spindle in her hand. Okay, so, and he goes on to talk about how Jacob Grimm tried to connect her with some older Earth mothers, and he's not, again, particularly, and trying to look at the etymology of the name and what it might mean, because there's some, difficulty about that. Perchta, her name actually Perchta's day is the day of Epiphany, January 6th, okay? And there's this idea, and Smith here also associates her with, he talks about another article by Hilda Ellis Davidson, Lost Beliefs of Northern Europe. Davidson makes interesting comparisons, hinting at possible parallels between Perchta's wagon or plow and English Plough Monday ceremonies, or between Perchta's association with spinning and St. Brige's affinity with the same activity. Some of the customs associated with Perchta, processions and visitations, for instance, are also seen as similar, if not related, to activities of the saints' representatives, the biddies, fantastically arrayed youths who might visit Irish houses and terrify children on the eve of St. Brige's Day, 1st of February. Okay, and I mentioned this one specifically because this idea of these fantastically arrayed youths who cause mischief is also associated with Gryla, as we will see in a moment. I'm just pulling up all of my notes here on this because I want to make sure I talk about everything so that we have these interpretations. Yeah, okay, this is just another description. Perchta may have two forms. She may appear as beautiful and white as snow like her name, or as elderly and haggard. In many old descriptions, Perchta had one large foot, sometimes called a goose foot or a swan foot. Grimm thought the strange foot symbolized her being a higher being who could shapeshift to animal form. He noticed that Bertha, the strange foot, exists in many languages. And he gives some examples of that phrase, that epithet, the idea of Bertha with the big foot. It is apparently a swan maiden's foot, which is a mark of her higher nature she cannot lay aside. At the same time, the spinning woman's splay foot that worked the treadle. Okay. Here they say Perchta was the upholder of cultural taboos, such as the prohibition against spinning on holidays. Now, again, spinning and wool are going to prove to be important in these stories. In the folklore of Bavaria and Austria, Perchta was said to roam the countryside at midwinter and to enter homes during the 12 days between Christmas and Epiphany, especially on Twelfth Night. She would know whether children and young servants of the household had behaved well and worked hard all year. If they had, they might find a small silver coin the next day in a shoe or pail. If they had not, she would slit their bellies open, remove their stomach and guts, and stuff the hole with straw and pebbles. She was particularly concerned to see that the girls had spun the whole of their allotted portion of flax or wool during the year. She would also slit people's bellies open and stuff them with straw if they ate something on the night of her feast day other than the traditional meal of fish and gruel. And he may mention, this is in the Wikipedia article, canonical and church documents characterize Perchta as synonymous with other leading female spirits, Holda, Diana, Herodias, Rochella, and Abundia. Diana, of course, being another, also like Artemis, whom we've also spoken about. And Artemis's role in dealing with young girls who misbehave, okay, or who are, don't give up their virginity in the proper way, for instance. So, rather interesting. Okay, so this is Perchta, okay? In contemporary culture, it says, Perchta is portrayed as rewarder of the generous, punisher of the bad, particularly lying children. Now, we can kind of recognize this Christmas tradition in the stories of Saint Nick or Santa Claus and perhaps Krampus. Or as, if you remember the David Sedaris, there's a very funny David Sedaris piece called 6 to 8 Black Men. And it was about a time he went to Holland, and they were talking about Christmas traditions, and says that Saint Nicholas appears with, comes to houses with 6 to 8 black men, which he, leaves presents for good children, and otherwise, these men take the bad children in their sack and carry them away and beat them. So this is also very similar to the legend of Krampus, who also has this, and you see many of these, probably at this time of year, you'll see a lot of articles about the St. Nicholas processions where he's proceeding with angels, and then there's these very scary demonic figures, Krampus figures, following him in the back. So while that is sort of a masculine version of Saint Nick, is the one who leaves presents, or Santa Claus, as we have in the United States, Father Christmas, I suppose, in England and some other parts. It's kind of interesting, and there was actually a whole article that I had seen about why monsters are still in Europe but not in America. And the theory was that the poem "The Night Before Christmas" that was written about saying, 'twas the night before Christmas and all through the house, not a creature stirring, not even a mouse, etc., etc., who wrote the original poem here. Visit from St. Nicholas, it was called, by Clement Clarke Moore. So some people blame that particular interpretation of the sort of Christmas, the judgment, the good and the bad, you're going to get presents if you're good, coal in your stocking if you're bad. That's kind of the way it morphed into American culture. None of this, you're going to be dragged off and beaten or eaten by, some figure. But this idea still occurs in Europe. And people, again, because we have a very different understanding of the meaning of that kind of a thing, today there's a lot of attempts to sort of sanitize that kind of stuff. Okay, so we've talked about Frau Perchta. That's kind of her basic story. So let me talk a little bit about Gryla. Now, Gryla is interesting. She originally was not associated with Christmas. She is an ogress, so it means she's a giant, scary-looking woman who lives in the mountains, okay? And some say she dwells in a cave. And when I think about that and about Perchta as dwelling either in the mountains or underneath a lake, I think all of those geographical locations, these are traditional entrances to the underworld. So keep that in mind, okay? Gryla is a giantess with an appetite for the flesh of mischievous children who she cooks in a large pot. Her husband, Lepaluti, is lazy and mostly stays at home in their cave. And Gryla, so in 13th century, Gryla is mentioned in the Prose Edda, okay, which is a Norse compilation of Norse mythology from that time. But she's not specifically connected to Christmas. Let me see if I actually have the quotes from the Prose Edda. Yeah, let me read a little bit from this. This is actually a Smithsonian article on Gryla, which was titled, "Why Iceland's Christmas Witch is Cooler and Scarier Than Krampus." Okay, it says, while Krampus may be king of holiday scares, his fans may overlook an equally nasty, much more formidable queen, a Christmas monster who lives further north in the frigid climes of Iceland, who goes by the name Gryla, the Christmas Witch. This tough ogress lives in a cave in Iceland's hinterlands, the matriarch of a family of strange creatures, launching attacks on nearby townships, snatching up misbehaving children and turning them into a delicious stew. You don't mess with Gryla, says Terry Gunnell, head of the folkloristics department at the University of Iceland. She rules the roost up in the mountains. Tales of the ogress begin as oral accounts, with the earliest written references found in the 13th century in historic sagas and poems throughout the region. And here we go, this is the one I'm thinking of. One reads, "Here comes Gryla down in the field with 15 tails on her," while another describes, "Down comes Gryla from the outer fields with 40 tails, a bag on her back, a sword knife in her hand, coming to carve out the stomachs of children who cry for meat during Lent." Okay. They're talking about the Icelandic Yule. According to Gunnell, the earliest celebrations of the season were viewed as a time not only to bring together relatives living and deceased, but also elves, trolls, and other magical and spooky creatures believed to inhabit the landscape. Sometimes these figures would visit in the flesh as masked figures going to farms and houses during the season. And again, you don't just see this in Iceland, you see this in other cultures as well. Gryla, whose name translates loosely to growler, okay, would be among these, showing up with a horned tail and a bag in which she would toss naughty children. She was certainly around in about 1300, not directly associated with Christmas, but associated with the threat that lives in the mountains. You never knew exactly where she was, said Gunnell. Long poems were written about her and a husband, but he didn't last long, as Gunnell explains. She ate one of her husbands when she got bored with him. Other bits of folklore describe a second troll-like husband and a giant man-eating Yule cat, known to target anybody who doesn't have on new clothes. Making a new pair of socks or long underwear as an imperative for any Icelandic holiday shopper. Filling out what Gunnell calls this highly dysfunctional family are Gryla's mob of large adult sons, the 13 Yule lads. Okay? Now, again, some versions there's only 9, but again, and these are the names I'm not going to try to describe to you, but you can easily look them up. If you look up the Yule lads, you can easily see what the names are and what they do. But they visit on specific days throughout the 12 days of Christmas and throughout December, unleashing their individual types of pestering. Now, Gryla does not get connected to Christmas until the early 19th century, when poems began to associate her with the holiday. It was about this time when the Yule lads and the Yule cat, which had been standalone Christmas characters with no connection to the Christmas witch, then became part of her big, creepy family. Prior to that, Gunnell would say that she is really a personification of the winter and the darkness and the snow getting closer and taking over the land again. Not only does she represent the threat of winter, she was seen as actually controlling the landscape. Now, that also is something to think about. Now, just going through this article, I just want to read a few more parts of it because I think they're interesting and, again, critical to the points that I want to make about both of these characters. In the 20th century, as American Christmas and its depiction of Santa Claus proliferated throughout Europe and beyond, attempts were made to Santify the Yule lads. Their bellies widened, their troll-like whiskers grew a bit bushier, and they acquired red and white fur costumes. They, like Santa, began leaving gifts rather than taking sausages, snacks, and so on. The Dutch tradition of children leaving out their shoes to find chocolates and treats the next morning also influenced this shift. Some critics tried to snuff out Gryla altogether, attempting to sideline the scary character with more family-friendly fare. One popular Christmas song describes her death, okay? And of course, in more recent years, Iceland as a whole, led by the National Museum of Iceland, have worked to return the Yule lads to their pre-Santa roots. And, let's see. Yeah, and interesting, Pilkington, who actually does a children's book on the Yule lads, he says, Gryla is but proven a tough figure to dislodge, with her likeness found in the capital city of Reykjavik and beyond, sometimes in the flesh. Children are truly terrified of Gryla in Iceland, says Pilkington. I visited children's play schools to demonstrate drawing skills, and if I draw Gryla, then 2 or 3 terrified children have to leave the room because it is too strong for them. So that's also very, very, I find that fascinating myself. Okay, so we're talking about these 2 figures. Now, some of the other things that are associated with them. So she sort of, so the Yule cat. Let me just talk about the Yule cat for a minute and its connection to Gryla. So he's Gryla's house pet. And it says the threat of being, but again, remember that the Gryla was originally written about in the 13th century. It's the 19th century, when folklore was being rewritten at that time, in these countries at that time, that she becomes associated with Christmas and connected to this Yule cat and to these Yule lads, okay? Though referred to as an ancient tradition, written accounts of the Yule cat have only been located as recently as the 19th century. The threat of being eaten by the Yule cat was used as farmers as an incentive for their workers to finish processing the autumn wool before Christmas. Now, I mention this because one of the things that we look at with Perchta, as well. Let's see. Okay, I'm going to read this. This is from the Wikipedia article. Initially, Perchta was the upholder of cultural taboo, such as the prohibition against spinning on the holidays. In folklore of Bavaria and Austria, Perchta was said to roam the countryside at midwinter, enter homes during the 12 days. Okay, I think I actually kind of read this, so I don't want to reread it. But remember I had said, particularly concerned to see that girls had spun the whole of their portion of flax or wool. So we see the same thing. This time it's the threat of the Yule cat, who is the cat of Gryla. In others, it's Perchta herself is going to come and rip your guts out if you don't do that. But if Gryla the Yule cat will rip you to shreds, okay, if you, they discover that. And again, there seems to be an association here with wool and spinning in particular, okay? So those I think are the elements that we want to look at going forward. Okay, so what we have here basically are monstrous folkloric figures, female figures particularly, that have to do with judgment, okay? If we think back to the Baba Yaga episode, there are some similarities there also with Baba Yaga, who is a force of nature. She is out in the woods, and she also kind of exacts a kind of a judgment on people as well, with those who are not good or wicked or who are lazy, suffering certain consequences that those who are good, will receive a reward. You can go back and listen to that podcast that I did with Joanna Madlock a couple months ago. That one should be among the Chthonia archives. That's a good one. So if you haven't heard that one, I encourage you to listen to it. Okay, so they're both associated with the 12 days of Christmas in some fashion. And there's this taboo about spinning in particular, and about, processing wool or processing flax, okay? And, so the question is, okay, why that in particular? There seems to be a broader sense of judgment, like, have you been good during the year? And, of course, the comment about, have you eaten meat during Lent? That kind of a thing. But it also, okay, in the most basic sense, it would make, when you think about the time of year that we're talking about, it's wintertime, okay? Even though this is Yule represents the return of the light, it's still quite a while. It's not roughly till Breege's Day, which is actually considered to be kind of midwinter, at least in a lot of European folklore. That's why Samhain or Halloween is sometimes considered to be the beginning of winter. This, in a way, would almost be the midwinter, and Breege's Day or Imbolc would be considered to be the beginning of spring in another way of looking at it, okay, if we don't just look at it by the solstices and the equinoxes. We don't tend to look at it that way, but just to kind of get a framework there. So, but nonetheless, winter is just known to be a very dark period. We're waiting for the light to increase at springtime. So, and of course, in almost all these cultures, the winter hag is the ruler, and always associated with a very old woman. Okay, and here's your associations, probably your Earth Mother, your death associations. Okay, the fact that these hags live in caves, the fact that they live under the water. These are all, like I said earlier, these are all traditional entrances to the underworld. If you look, for example, at all the ancient Greek entrances, supposedly to Hades, all of them were either underneath bodies of water or they are in caves. Okay, so there's definitely this sense of these as kind of being representing these kind of dark and forbidden, unfamiliar places that could lead to the underworld. And again, by this point, you have an association with the underworld and what's under the earth as being something very negative. So they end up having this kind of negative association that I'm not entirely sure they're supposed to have. There's certainly a very didactic element to this, the idea of you'd better behave, or, so, and a lot of us, I think tend to look at these stories as, the naughty and nice business. You have to be, you better be good and you better be nice. But I think even more so, there's a sense of trying to keep people from stepping outside the bounds of society or the bounds of the community. That like it's a taboo to violate these things. And at this particular time, there's the idea that winter has come, so everything already has to be prepared. The flax already has to be spun. Everybody has to have their clothes. So if you don't have your clothes, you're going to freeze. You're going to be naked and freeze to death, right? Just as all the harvest has to be done. So if somebody has not done their part during the year, that could affect the whole community. So these hags kind of maybe sort of are a representation of that threat. That threat, when you have not appropriately dealt with the natural flow of things, whether it be, through, and they seem to be associated particularly with clothing oneself in some way. Okay, so another association that they have is with the Feast of the Epiphany. Now, I think it's worth noting, now, as I already mentioned earlier, what Epiphany is. Okay, it's the arrival of the Magi. But the Epiphany also in ancient Greece was the Feast of the Kore, which is another, one of the other epithets used for the goddess, or one of the names really, for the goddess Persephone, whom we've also done an episode on. And as we know, Persephone spends part of her year in the bright upper world and part of her time as the goddess, the queen of the underworld, as the wife of Hades. So there's kind of a dual aspected Persephone here. And so again, we have this, and probably at this particular time of year, Persephone is associated more with the darkness. So that feast day is associated on January the 6th, just like Epiphany. So again, interesting because of course, the Feast of the Kore would have come before the Epiphany, but and that also is the day associated with Frau Perchta. So she is, so there's this idea of these kind of dark female figures associated with the moment of manifestation or clarity. Okay. And that's rather interesting. I'm not going to pretend that I know exactly how to piece those two things together. There's probably a lot of other associations that you could connect if you looked at some other folkloric sources. But to me, certainly that association with these, these kind of reckoning with these, the dark Earth mothers, if you will, and the fact that this is so associated with this particular time of year and has become intertwined with Christian legends and beliefs about this particular period of time. Is worth noting. Okay, so let's look at some other associations here. There's cannibalistic and monstrous ones. Now, in Gryla's case, she likes to collect children and eat them. Okay, in the stories of Krampus and some of the others, they also grab bad children and put them in a sack, but they don't eat them. They just beat them and scare the hell out of them, basically. But they both have to do with slitting the belly open, which is interesting. And in like I said, in the case one, she fills it with straw instead and garbage. And, so this cannibalizing, again, we're back to the theme and the archetype of the devouring mother, and what does she take? She's taking your innards. She's taking the innermost part of you, the part of you, that allows you to eat, the part that allows you to, to process your food. She removes that. And and stuffs you with straw instead. Or in the case of Gryla, will actually just, turn you into a stew and eat you. So again, so you have this idea, that obviously there's the didactic threat of, you had better follow the standards or this is what's going to happen to you. And I'm just looking at my notes here. Yeah, I also have the sheep and the wool connection. It's also worth thinking about the fact that Bridge's Day, which is February 1st or 2nd, also known as Imbolc, has to do with the birthing of the lambs. So sheep tend to be kind of an integral part of this as well. At Yule time, it seems that all the wool and the flax also from the fields all needs to be processed at that time. So there's kind of the need to have everything ready for the warmth. And this kind of threat of being devoured by natural forces, really. Either being devoured or being gutted by them in some way, okay? So that's, was certainly a very real kind of a threat. We can probably, we don't think as hard about those kinds of things because today, I mean, at least in most modern countries, I mean, there's obviously exceptions around the world that are different, but we're not so reliant on all of that. So it on all those cycles of nature and so forth. In fact, we're probably very much out of touch with nature. And it's that loss of connection. But at least part of that loss of connection, it seems to be our fear of this particular side of it. But you don't escape it. When we have, vicious tornadoes and hurricanes and natural disasters. I mean, that's there. I mean, really, there's the stark in your face that you don't really have as much control over nature as you think. And that kind of gets me to the point of what I call sanitization. They talk about, as I read, the Yule lads, for instance, become mischief makers who then do good and now leave presents instead of ripping your guts out or taking taking something or whatever. The version of the Gryla story where eventually she's the bad lady who's killed. Now there's taking the and changing it up. Because now this is something, I personally, I go back to the idea of the whole fear of death. Does death come close to you or do you keep death away from you? Now you might just say, well, obviously nobody's looking to die, so no, nobody keeps death close. But I mean that in a much bigger way. Death is one of those things that, and loss and the kinds of things that winter tends to represent. Does the community embrace it? When somebody dies, is it everybody's there and in the room? Is it, if I think of medieval times when, the market stalls and things would be in the churchyard where the cemetery was, as opposed to, say, what the Romans would do. It's like everybody, all the dead was taken and buried in a pit outside of town, and we don't want to be close to it or know anything about it. And today, even though we have cemeteries, there tends to be a sense of staying away from the dead, keeping death at bay. When people get sick, we put them in nursing homes and we don't, with these, they're kind of very false, colors and stuff to try to make things. There's just a real sense of we want sickness and death kept away from us. And it's not so much that, hey, we want to be sick and we want to die. It's more a case of whether or not you accept that this is part of life or not. Okay. And these particular figures to me are representing sort of, some of these gruesome realities of the kind of loss you can suffer. But, and part of the danger of being so connected to nature and to the spirits of nature. I feel like all of modern religion and so forth is about staying away from that, like, sanitizing it, being safe from it, being in your little fence, away from all of that. But that doesn't really serve you as a human being and it doesn't necessarily make you immune. I think of some of these, like these zombie movies where everybody's hiding behind a wall and then eventually the zombies figure out how to scale the wall. You can't stay away from the scary influences forever. So the question is, how do you incorporate them in your life? How do you deal with them? How do you negotiate them? Okay. So, so we tend to sanitize things because it becomes more like, let's not scare the little children. But it's also like, well, yeah, but you don't necessarily need to outright scare kids, but, you're not giving someone a complete, picture of life if they don't understand that, don't give them kind of an arrogance and entitlement about how things are and how life is. Because, we are still ultimately at the mercy of nature, and ultimately, this good versus evil nonsense. We're gonna vanquish the big bad witch. You're not going to. That's this is all part of who we are and where we are. So don't assume that you can, part of what my whole thing in telling and retelling these stories is you can't, like, stop acting like this is a bad thing that you have to get rid of. It's something, it's not always pleasant, but it does represent certain things that need to be negotiated in your life in some way. And it's better to face them than to try to pretend that you're going, somebody's going to kill off the big bad monster, or, that they're going to go away. And they're not. They're a danger that is always there. And how will you respond to that danger? How do you respond to that in terms of your own survival? Okay. So I think that's about all I'm going to say. I do know, just from listening to other podcasts, that sometimes I tend to get a little rambly towards the end. So I think I will avoid that. I have been working, I'm going to be collaborating to try to do some overhaul on the Chthonia website, which right now is, I was looking at it with a consultant the other day. It does need a fair amount of work. So I'm gonna see what I can get done myself, but I'm probably gonna be looking into overhauling. But those kind of things you don't want to do too quickly. You kind of want to, organize it first. So it may take me a couple months. But Chthonia.net is still there. At least all the information about everything is there. Podcasts are there, and they're also on metapsychosis.com/series/Chthonia. If you just want to listen to them, well, in either place, actually, you can just listen to them on the computer. If you want to download the podcast, iTunes, Spotify, Google Play, you can, whatever your favorite podcast app is, you can download this and subscribe. And also, I have my Patreon page, patreon.com/Chthonia. Thank you, as always, very much to the patrons I currently have. And I would love to have more of you, join in and help, because there are more benefits and perks that will come to people who join the Patreon page. I have some writing that I'm finishing up, so people have early access to some of that material. I sometimes have giveaways. I just had one recently of my book, Death and the Maiden. And there's going to be a lot of other cool stuff coming up in the next year, because a lot of my focus is now being turned towards working on this. Part of the reason I don't end up spending more time on this, I get the podcast out every couple weeks, but I also have like another full-time job and another teaching job and all this other stuff. So I I really need to kind of reorganize myself and make some more time for this next year, and that's actually something already in progress. So I would look forward. I'm hoping some of you can help with additional support. And if not, just, listen and enjoy the podcast, leave comments for me. I would be very happy. If you read my book, please review it on Amazon, because, I understand that a lot of these things take time, and I get why people don't frequently want to do it, but it really does help if you do that. It helps boost a lot of things, if you do. With that, I will say happy winter holidays, whatever you celebrate. I will speak to you in the next episode.